So we'll be reading from 2 Samuel, verse 15, 1 to 5, and then we'll go over to 13, down to 16, and then from 24 to 35. In the course of time, Absalom provided himself with a chariot and horses, and with 50 men to run ahead of him. He would get up early and stand by the side of the road leading to the city gate. Whenever anyone came with a complaint to be placed before the king for a decision, Absalom would call out to him, "What town are you from?" He would answer, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." Then Absalom would say to him, "Look, your claims are valid and proper, but there is no representative for the king to hear you." And Absalom would add, "If only I would be appointed judge in the land, then everyone who had a complaint or a case could come to me, and I would see that they would receive justice. Also, whenever anyone approached him to bow down before him, Absalom would reach out his hand, take hold of him, and kiss him." From verse 13, as a messenger came and told David, "The hearts of the people of Israel are with Absalom." Then David said to all his officials who were there with him in Jerusalem, "Come, we must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin on us and put the city to the sword." The king's officials answered him, "Your servants are ready to do whatever our lord the king chooses." The king set out, and his entire household following him, but he left 10 concubines to take care of the palace. We'll move on to verse 24. Zadok was there too, and all the Levites who were with him were carrying the ark of the covenant of God. They set down the ark of God. And Abiathar offered sacrifices until all the people had finished leaving the city. Then the king said to Zadok, "The ark of God, take the ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it as its dwelling place again. But if he says, 'I'm not pleased with you,' then I'm ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him." The king said to Zadok the priest, "Do you understand? Go back to the city with my blessing. Take your son Ahimaaz with you, and also Abiathar, son of Jonathan. You and Abiathar return with your 2 sons. I will wait at the fords in the wilderness until word comes from you to inform me." So Zadok and Abiathar took the ark of God back to Jerusalem and stayed there. But David continued up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered and he was barefoot. All the people with him covered their heads too, and they were weeping as they went up. Now David had been told Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. So David prayed, "Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness." When David arrived at the summit where people used to worship God, Hushai the Archite was there to meet him, his robe torn and dust on his head. Then David said to him, "If you go with me, you will be a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, 'Your Majesty, I will be your servant. I was your father's servant in the past, but now I will be your servant, and you can help me by frustrating Ahithophel's advice.'" This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you, Jackie. Those were some fun names to try and get through. It's always fun when we choose the reading and then we have to break the news to whoever's reading the passage that there's some humdingers in there. Keep that passage open. Welcome to you. If we haven't met, my name's Nils, one of the pastors here, and it's really good to have you along. We're towards the back end of a series in 2 Samuel, so you've missed a few things, but that's okay. Either go and check it out on our website, or hopefully you'll pick up the story as we get into this section this morning. But let's read from chapter 16. I'm just going to pick up the story a little bit later on from chapter 16, verse 5, and I'm going to read to verse 14 of chapter 16. As King David approached Bahurim, a man from the same clan as Saul's family came out from there. His name was Shimei, son of Gera. And he cursed as he came out, and he pelted David and all the king's officials with stones, though all the troops and the special guard were on David's right and left. As he cursed, Shimei said, get out, you murderer, you scoundrel. The Lord has repaid you for all the blood you shed in the household of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. The Lord has given the kingdom into the hands of your son, Absalom. You have come to ruin because you're a murderer. Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said to the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and cut off his head. But the king said, what does this have to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord said to him, curse David, who can ask, why do you do this? David then said to Abishai and all the officials, my son, my own flesh and blood, is trying to kill me. How much more then this Benjamite? Leave him alone. Let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be that the Lord will look upon my misery and restore to me his covenant blessing instead of his curse today. So David and his men continued along the road, while Shimei was going along the hillside opposite him, cursing as he went and throwing stones at him and showering him with dirt. And the king and all the people with him arrived at their destination exhausted, and there he refreshed himself. This is the word of the Lord. Let's ask for God's help as we come to it. Lord, thank you for this ancient text in front of us that is your living word. We ask now that you'd open it up to us, give us eyes to see what's there, give us hearts to accept what's there as we try and see how it impacts our lives, and help us, Lord, to have the courage to live differently in the light of what you say to us today. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, if you have been here for our journey in 2 Samuel so far, you may at this point feel a little bit of motion sickness, right? It's been an up and down ride. It seems like we've taken so many twists and turns. We've had the high point of chapter 7, which is where God makes those incredible promises to David that one day he will establish his kingdom forever and ever. One of David's sons, his descendants, will rule over an eternal kingdom that will stretch to the ends of the earth, ultimately. I mean, if you're into highlighting your Bible, chapter 7, hopefully, is full of highlights, because that's the high point. But then you have the catastrophic failure of David with Bathsheba and his murder of Uriah. And then the awful, hideous passage from last week with the rape and the murder that we see in that text. And what we are realizing as we read the story unfold is that David's family, while God makes these great promises to them, are in tatters. They're falling apart. And so the question is, has David undermined the very promises that God has made? Right? What hope is there still for God to fulfill what he's promised? And it's about to get worse in this passage. Now, we're looking at 3 chapters this morning, so we can't possibly cover all the detail, but it's important that we keep them together because they're all about really the same thing. They all have this question hanging over them. Can you trust God when all you can see is trouble? Can you trust God when all you are experiencing is trouble? So let's look. 3 things. The source of David's trouble, his response to the troubles, and then God's purpose through those troubles. Let's firstly look at the source of David's troubles. And it turns out the source of David's troubles are from within his own family. His own son Absalom is the one leading the attack. Let's read from verse 1. In the course of time, Absalom provided himself with a chariot and horses and 50 men to run ahead of him. Literally, verse 1 says, after this. And that's supposed to remind us of what's just happened, right? So after this, well, what is the this? If you go back to the end of chapter 14 that we looked at last week, what did we have? Well, we had David and Absalom seeming as if they'd now reconciled. At the end of the chapter, Absalom bows before David. David kisses Absalom. It looks like a happy ending for this family. Well, in the very next verse after this, we have Absalom buying a chariot. Now we say, well, that's very strange. What's he doing that for? It's kind of amusing because, you can't even use a chariot in Jerusalem. There's no point in the history of Israel's story until this point that we have heard of chariots in Jerusalem. Whenever David comes across plunder, he always burns the chariots. They're no use to him, right? It's a bit like the story this last week of the Nigerian rapper who crashed his 4 million rand McLaren in the streets of Sea Point. I don't know if you saw this. 4 million rand vehicle. He's driving this McLaren at however fast and crashes it in the side of the wall of some house in Sea Point. You can't drive a McLaren in Sea Point, right? Not at speed anyway. That's not what it's designed for. Well, here you have chariots in Jerusalem. It's crazy. What is he doing? He's building his image, isn't he? That's what he's doing. Chariots are about power. They look like power. And so he gets some horses too. He gets 50 men to run ahead of him wherever he goes, his very own blue light brigade. He's trying to look the part because he knows that people look up to those who look the part. I mean, the same is true in our culture. Nothing's changed. We have celebrities at every level of society. We even have celebrity pastors, and we give them more weight than we give ordinary pastors. That's okay, but it's not a very good strategy. Right? Never look up to those who look up to themselves or who are gunning for power or position or prestige. David should have known this. And the reason he should have known this even more is because if we take ourselves back to the very moment when Israel first asked for a king, in 1 Samuel, which we haven't had a look at, but if you go back to that moment, Samuel said, watch out that this person you choose as king doesn't want chariots and horses and people to run ahead of them. Those 3 things are mentioned. And that's exactly what Absalom wants. So he's working on his image. He's not just working on his image, though. He's also playing a very strategic political game. Did you notice? Verse 2 says he would wait at the city gate for anyone who would come there with a case that is going to be presented to the king for justice, because in those days the king is the judge as well. And he would intercept them and he would say, hey, how's that case? Tell me about it. And they would explain the case and he would say, oh, you have such a strong case. If I was in position of power, I would rule in your favor, no doubt. Isn't it a pity that there's so much bureaucracy and you're not going to get to see the king? Oh, if only I was in power. It's a classic strategy, isn't it? You point out the problem in the bureaucracy and then you put yourself forward as the solution to that problem. And then, not only that, but he also then plays the charm game. When he's out in public, he makes out as if he's a kingly figure. He kisses those who come to him, just like David kissed his son at the end of chapter 14. And he looked the part, right? He's handsome. We're told in chapter 14 there's no flaw from head to toe. Now, is that true of you? Has anyone ever said of you that there is no flaw from head to toe? This long, we're told, flowing locks of hair that he used to weigh on the scales. I kind of imagine this B-grade male character in a novel, usually named Hunter or Dante or something. That's Absalom in my mind, right? He's that sort of guy. What is he doing? Well, what he's doing is very strategically and very carefully and very cunningly planning David's downfall. And he's very patient too, isn't he? Because he waited 2 years before he killed Amnon. Remember that story? 2 years of plotting and planning. And then 3 years when he was in exile, waiting. And then 2 more years when he came back to Jerusalem before he even reconciled with David. Now we're told it's 4 years before he makes his final move. Verse 7. At the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, let me go to Hebron and fulfill a vow that I made to the Lord. He makes up as if he's got this vow that he needs to fulfill. He says, let me go back to Hebron. And Hebron is a very strategic place for Absalom to go. Not only is it his hometown where his support base is strongest, it's also the place where David was first anointed as king. And it's Abraham's hometown. It's a place that is significant for the promises that God has made to God's people. And this is where he makes the final arrangements to seize control of the kingdom. Verse 10. Then Absalom sent secret messages throughout the tribes of Israel to say, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpets, then say, Absalom is king in Hebron. Well, word gets back to David that things are about to go south. And what's strange is that he hasn't done anything in the last 4 years to stop this, right? And I can't think that it's because he didn't know something was going on. I mean, Absalom has been scheming and networking and making plans with everybody. It looks like everybody's on his side by the end of the 4 years. I think more likely is what we've seen the last 2 chapters, is that David has become completely paralyzed by his guilt and his grief, and so he just doesn't do anything. But now, something is changing. David is finally waking up, and he realizes that if Absalom returns, this is very, very bad news. Verse 14. Then David said to all his officials and all who were with him in Jerusalem, come, we must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin on us and put the city to the sword. He will bring ruin on us, he says. Ruin. I don't know if you've experienced ruin in your life. We all do from time to time to some extent. Right? There is no free pass on trouble. And so, the story just alerts us to the fact that we live in a world where there is all kinds of trouble that comes our way. Whether it's in your life at the moment, it is certain to come at some point. And so the question is not whether you have trouble or what that trouble looks like. The question is, how do you respond to that trouble? What response are you going to have when the world around you seems to be crumbling? That's David's situation. So secondly, let's look then at David's response to his troubles. How does he respond to all of this? Everything is falling apart. The kingdom is slipping from his grip. What is he going to do? Well, we're going to tag along with David as he leaves Jerusalem, as he flees with all these people who join him. And on the way, he has all these encounters with these strange different people. But what we see, and this is so surprising, is that as David's troubles increase, his faith seems to increase. His faith seems to awaken. This passivity, this sort of paralyzed state that he's been in, he's now woken up to the fact that God actually is the one that he needs to make the center of his life. Now, there's a hint of how he's seeing things and the way that he's seeing his future even differently right at the start of this section in chapter 15, verse 16. As David's leaving, let me read, the king set out with his entire household following him, but he left 10 concubines to take care of the palace. Now, we won't get into why David has concubines, right? We've spoken about that before. Remember, the Bible is describing what happens. It's not saying this should have happened. But the fact is, he had concubines. But what commentators seem to agree on is that this strange detail about him leaving the 10 concubines behind to take care of the palace sort of indicates that in David's mind, at least, this is not the end of his story. There's some residual faith that reminds him that God had made promises that he would rule over his people and that his family would ultimately rule over Jerusalem and over Israel. And so somehow, this is David's way of saying, I'm coming back. You take care of the palace for me. I'm coming back. Now, as it turns out, this decision has consequences that Absalom, in his evil ways, leverages for his advantage. But still, it's a small sign that David has not given up on God. And as they get to the edge of the city, all of David's traveling party kind of pass on by him. And here we meet one of the first characters of the story on this journey. His name is Ittai, the Gittite. Now, there's so many characters that you meet along the way. It can get really confusing. So I thought, how can I try and help us to memorize who's who in the story? And I thought, let me find a picture of Ittai the Gittite. So here's what he looks like. It's not an actual photo. Ittai is a Philistine. Okay, verse 18 tells us there were 600 Gittites or Philistines who were also following David. And when David was on the run from Saul, he'd spent time in Philistine country. So he'd actually made connections that these Philistines are now loyal to him. Now, the reason he's got an army hat on there, helmet, is because even though David urges him to go back, to leave, no, don't come with me, he is adamant that he's going to stick and he's going to fight for David. Right? He's a fighter. Now, David, for his part, I mean, who wouldn't want 600 Philistines as part of your crew who are going to defend your cause and fight for you? But David's response is surprising. Have a look at verse 20. He says to Ittai, "You only came yesterday, and today shall I make you wander about with us? When I do not know where I'm going, go back. Take your people with you. And may the Lord show you kindness and faithfulness." Now, that word kindness is a key biblical word. It's the Hebrew word chesed, and it means steadfast love. It's a word that is used to describe God's unbreakable, committed love to his covenant people. We haven't heard David use that word since chapter 9. He's hardly sought God. He's hardly reached out to God at all. Here he again brings up the fact that God is trustworthy and faithful, that he's going to stick with his people and his promises. And so he says to Ittai, "Look, you go. We know who God is." Ittai is not going anywhere. Verse 21. Ittai replied to the king, "As surely as my Lord lives, and as my Lord the king lives, wherever my Lord the king may be, whether it means life or death, there will your servant be." This Philistine is more loyal than David's closest family and his friends. You know, it's interesting, isn't it, in Jesus' life, how many of those who came alongside him to follow him were outsiders, foreigners, people who the rest of society didn't regard as much. Well, let's see who else David meets along the way. Verse 23. The whole countryside wept aloud as all the people passed by. The king also crossed the Kidron Valley, and all the people moved on toward the wilderness. Zadok was there too, and all the Levites who were with him were carrying the ark of the covenant of God. And they set down the ark of God, and Abiathar offered sacrifices until all the people had finished leaving the city. So Zadok is the next person we meet. Here's a picture of how I imagine he would look like. I think that's the closest to a priest I could find amongst the emojis. And he's there with Abiathar, who's also a priest, and the two sons. And at some point along the journey, David turns around and sees them and sees that they're actually carrying the Ark of the Covenant. Now, that's a dangerous business. We've seen that already in 2 Samuel. You don't touch the Ark of the Covenant, right? It's a dangerous thing. But here these priests are willing to risk their lives for the sake of David. And what they're thinking, I suppose, is wherever the king goes, God's Ark should go. Again, David's response is very interesting. Verse 25. Then the king said to Zadok, "Take the ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it in his dwelling place again." Isn't that striking? In other words, I don't need a lucky charm. I don't need some sort of symbol of God's presence. I believe that God is going to be with me. I believe in something bigger than just a symbol of his presence. He's willing to place his future in God's hands, isn't he? Whatever happens. Can you see how something is awakened in David? The next person that he encounters along the way, well, he doesn't actually encounter him. He hears about him, and it's something really important that's going to affect the way forward. Verse 30. But David continued up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered, and he was barefoot. All the people who were with him covered their heads too, and were weeping as they went. Can you kind of feel the weight of what this means to leave behind the kingdom, leave behind Jerusalem? And now, to make it worse, now David had been told Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. Ahithophel. Who's Ahithophel? Well, this is how I imagine he might look. And you might say, well, why has he got a bandage on his head? Well, Ahithophel is an ex-advisor to David. He's one of his closest confidants. He's one of the guys that David relied upon throughout his reign as king. But now he hears that Ahithophel has gone over to the enemy. He now works for Absalom, and he's working with Absalom to bring David down. What's with the bandage? Well, turns out Ahithophel is Bathsheba's grandfather. In other words, he's got the wounds and the scars of what had happened to his granddaughter. It's the only thing that explains why he has now gone to Absalom. He has resented David since that moment. And he has now seen his opportunity to bring David down. What does David do when he hears this shocking news? Well, notice just to the previous slide, at the end of that section, it says, so David prayed. He prayed, Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness. We haven't heard David pray since his son died in chapter 12. Not once has he reached out to God. And now he turns back to God in prayer. And he asks that somehow God would sabotage Ahithophel's advice. How does this prayer get answered? Sometimes we have to wait for God to answer our prayers. Sometimes it happens straight away. And sometimes he even uses us to bring about the answer. Have a look at verse 32, the very next verse. When David arrived at the summit, where people used to worship God, Hushai the Archite was there to meet him. His robe torn, dust on his head, and David said to him, if you go with me, you'll be a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, your majesty, I'll be your servant. I was your father's servant in the past, but now I'll be your servant. Then you can help me by frustrating Ahithophel's advice. In other words, David prays that Ahithophel's advice would be frustrated, and then he sees Hushai and he says, all right, here's the answer to my prayer. You know, he doesn't believe in this thing where you let go and let God. Have you heard this? In other words, it sounds like you just pray and leave it up to God and you sit on your hands and do nothing. No, David prays. He trusts that God is going to do something, but then he works hard towards bringing about the thing he's prayed for. That's okay. Right? God is sovereign. And so here's Hushai. I think he looked a little bit like this when David sent him back to Jerusalem. Do you know why he's got the disguise on? Right, he's going to be David's inside man. He's going to be the double agent. Maybe he's a bit older than this. It says he was too old to tag along. David says, you're going to be a burden to me, so you go back. But he's going undercover to be this sort of agent to help frustrate Ahithophel's plans. Can you see again how David is putting God back at the center of his thoughts? He's reaching out to God for the answer to his predicament. In his troubles, he turns instinctively now to God for answers and direction. Now, there's others that we meet along the way. He meets Ziba, who's Mephibosheth's servant, and there's a whole story there that we don't have time to look at. I would like to go ahead to the last character that we meet and just spend a few minutes looking at Shimei. He's the one that we came across in the reading that I did. Verse 5, let's have a look of chapter 16. As King David approached Bahurim, a man from the same clan as Saul's family came out from there, and his name was Shimei, son of Gera. And he cursed as he came out, and he pelted David and all the king's officials with stones, though all the troops and the special guard were on David's right and left. Shimei, this is the only emoji I thought would capture him. Right? He's angry. He's super angry. If you ever use that emoji, you know that you've been angry at times. And he's shouting, and he's cursing, and he's swearing, and he's throwing stones. And what he's saying is, you're a murderer. You're a murderer. That's why you're in the mess you're in, David. You're a murderer. God is bringing punishment on you. And interestingly, he's got his facts wrong. Because the murder that he's thinking of is not the murder of Uriah, which of course David is guilty for. He's actually saying you're guilty of Saul's murder. He's got his facts totally wrong. But nevertheless, he's angry. Oh, somebody's car's going. If you recognize that alarm, go and have a check. We have a winner. So David's men, they hear all this happening. They say, well, let's go across. Let's take his head off. That'll keep him quiet. Verse 11. This is David's response. Leave him alone. Let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be that the Lord will look upon my misery and restore to me his covenant blessing instead of his curse today. So David and his men continued along the road while Shimei was going alongside the hill opposite him, cursing as he went and throwing stones at him and showering him with dirt. It's almost a comical scene, isn't it? But David's words are deadly serious. I mean, he knows that Shimei's got his facts wrong, no doubt, right? But at the same time, he knows that God is in control of what is going on right at this moment. He says, yes, I am responsible for the mess that we're in. Right? David admits that they're in the situation they're in because of his sin. But even more incredible than that, he says, did you notice verse 12? He says, God has made a covenant with me. Right? He made promises to bring blessing, not cursing. And so I'm going to trust that beyond the cursing I'm experiencing here and now is blessing, because he's promised that. He's promised to bring blessing to me and my family. So I'm willing to go through the misery now. I'm willing to face up to the trouble that I'm going through now. It's a remarkable turnaround that we see in David's life here. This reawakening of real, genuine faith. And the worse that it gets for him, as I say, the stronger his faith seems to get. And friends, that is how God uses the troubles that we face. I don't know what troubles you're going through at the moment, but I do know that God's plan and purpose through troubles is to strengthen our faith, to refine our faith, to find us in a place where we can realize how helpless and dependent on him we are, so that we would reach out to him to be the place where we put our trust and our hope. David can't make sense of what's going on around him. You know, sometimes we want to know when trouble comes, well, why? What's the cause of this? Is it because I've sinned? Is it because people are doing wrong to me? Is it just because Satan is evil and he's attacking me? David doesn't try to answer those questions. His answer to those questions is yes, all three. It's a mixture, isn't it? It's always a mixture. And the point is not, why did I end up in this situation, but what is God wanting me to do as I face the trouble and as I reach out to him? And so he throws himself totally on the will of God. You know, it's interesting, there's one other story in the Bible of someone facing life-threatening opposition and having to flee Jerusalem or leave Jerusalem on the back of what's happening. 1,000 years later, Jesus, we're told, crosses the Kidron Valley. It's the only other time in the Bible where we're told of the geography like that matches up to this story. And he himself goes up the Mount of Olives, just like David. He literally follows in David's footsteps. And as he gets to the point of facing his own death, Jesus prays this all-important prayer. He says, not my will, but yours be done. Not my will, but yours be done. How do you pray that? How does David know that he needs to pray to this kind of God and rely on this kind of God? And the only way that you know that is if you have absolute trust that he is doing something good, that he's bringing about his good purposes. See, David knew he was coming back to the city. Jesus knew he was coming back. And so they could entrust themselves totally to their Heavenly Father. Because God is good, and God is doing something good. Lastly, I want us to look at God's bigger purpose, perhaps even, behind David's troubles. We've already seen God's purpose in David's own life, and let's not discount that, right? God was using the troubles in David's life to refine and shape his faith, but he was doing something even bigger and more far-reaching than that. Let's pick up the story in chapter 16. Absalom has now stormed into Jerusalem with his followers and his fighters, and it turns out David left in just the nick of time. And with David, or rather with Absalom, is David's ex-advisor Ahithophel that we met earlier. And he's the one who Absalom has turned to time and time again for advice. He's the one that you'd expect Absalom to turn to for advice in this situation. And he's, by the way, given Absalom advice many times. We read the terrible story in chapter 16 of the advice that he gives Absalom to sleep with those 10 concubines that David left behind. In the sight of all Israel, he says, why would he say something like that? It's not a sex thing, it's a political power thing, isn't it? He's actually declaring in that moment that I am in charge and this kingdom does no longer belong to David. Even his concubines belong to me. But it's not just Ahithophel who's there. Hushai is there too. Notice what happens as Absalom bumps into him in verse 16. Then Hushai the Archite, David's confidant, went to Absalom and said, "Long live the king! Long live the king!" Absalom said to Hushai, "So this is the love you show your friend? If he's your friend, why didn't you go with him?" Hushai said to Absalom, "No, the one chosen by the Lord, by these people and by all the men of Israel, his will I be, and I will remain with him." It's a clever response, isn't it? Because he doesn't once mention that he's going to be with Absalom. He says, no, the one chosen by the Lord, I'll be with him. And Absalom's pride is such that he says, oh, he's talking about me. Really, he's talking about David. You see, God is about fulfilling his purposes and plans, as we've already seen. And he is about to answer the prayer that David prayed. This is God's kingdom, and nothing's going to stop God's purposes in his kingdom. And so when Absalom turns to Ahithophel for advice once again, as you expect him to, Ahithophel comes up with this great plan to get rid of David once and for all. And we don't have time to look at all the details, but he basically says to Absalom, listen, you've got to strike while David is at his weakest. Go and get him, go and take him out now, during the night, and get rid of him once and for all. It's a brilliant plan. David is at his weakest. His band of followers and fighters is still small. But for some reason, Absalom says, that's a great plan. Let's hear what Hushai thinks. He would never do that unless God was at work, frustrating Ahithophel's advice. And so he turns to Hushai for a second opinion. And Hushai says, yeah, it's a good plan, but it's not as good as my plan. And he says, what you should do rather is give David a bit more time so that we can gather a bigger army. Right? David is a fighter. He's going to be trouble if you go at him now. Give him some time. We'll get a big army together and we'll take him out once and for all. And Absalom says, that's brilliant. In fact, not just Absalom, everybody says that's brilliant. Verse 14 of chapter 17. Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the advice of Hushai the Archite is better than that of Ahithophel. Why? For the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. Friends, God is bringing about a bigger plan than just the reformation and rejuvenation of David. He's building his kingdom. The promises that he made to David are still on track. Nothing is going to turn them off track because God is going to bring them about. And so this whole thing is about bringing down Absalom and reestablishing David's family line. Now, how that all happens, come back next week. You have to come for the second part of this story. But I want you to see just how unstoppable God's plans are. You know, Jesus said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will never prevail against it. In other words, nothing is going to stop God's plans even today. Even Satan, with all his scheming and cunning, cannot stop what God is doing in this world. What hope is there? If Satan, the most evil being in this universe, doing the most evil he can possibly do, what hope is there for him if God even uses that to achieve his good purposes? And of course, the place that we see this clearest of all is at the cross. The most evil event, the most tragic and evil event in all of history, God turns toward the greatest good in all of history. In fact, he plans for it to be the greatest good in all of history. Friends, if you face trouble in your own life, you need to know with absolute certainty that however evil and hard it seems, however much the trouble seems to be overwhelming you, God is still on his throne. And he's not only doing something in your life, which he is doing, he's also bringing about a bigger purpose that you can't even begin to comprehend. We've got to trust him. Let's pray together.